I walked into the courtroom knowing exactly how this was going to go. Or at least, I thought I did. My wife of 12 years sat across from me, her arms folded, that smug little smirk she'd been perfecting ever since she filed for divorce. When the judge asked her opening statement, she leaned back and said, clear enough for the whole room to hear, "I'm taking 70% of his millions, including his father's estate." The words cracked through the silence like a gunshot. People in the gallery shifted in their seats. Some even laughed out loud. My attorney's pen froze mid-scribble. The judge's eyebrows shot up, but he stayed composed. Me? I didn't move a muscle. I kept my face stone still because I'd been preparing for this moment for over a year. My name is David Mercer. I'm 43 years old, and until that day I'd thought I'd seen every kind of betrayal a man could stomach. I built my own real estate company from scratch, turned rundown blocks into profitable neighborhoods, and watched competitors try to knife me in the back. But nothing cut like this. My wife, Allison, the woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, had been sleeping next to me every night while she planned to gut me alive in court. The courtroom erupted after her demand, a wave of shocked murmurs, even a few chuckles. To them, it must have sounded like the setup to a bad joke. But she wasn't joking. She believed every word. She thought she'd walk away with not just most of my net worth, but also my father's estate. Property that had been in my family for 3 generations. Property she had no legal right to touch. What Allison didn't know was that I'd anticipated her exact move. I stayed seated for a few seconds longer than necessary, letting the noise settle. Then I rose, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the judge's bench with the calm precision of a man who'd rehearsed every step. From inside my folder, I slid out a simple 2-page document and placed it on his desk. My voice didn't rise above a whisper, but it carried across the entire courtroom. Check again. The judge glanced down at the papers. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. His jaw shifted, fighting a smile. Then, as he looked back at Allison, the corners of his mouth broke into open laughter. The sound echoed off the walls, filling the room like a verdict all its own. Allison's smirk vanished. She looked from the judge to me, confusion draining into something darker. Panic. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. That laugh was enough. She had just stepped into a trap I'd been building piece by piece for months, and she didn't even realize the door had already slammed shut. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just a divorce hearing anymore. It was war. And in war, silence is sometimes the sharpest weapon you have. People think betrayal hits like a thunderclap. Fast. Loud. But in reality, it's quieter than that. It's a shift in tone. A look that lingers too long. A smile that doesn't reach the eyes. That's how it started with Allison. At first, it was small things. She stopped asking about my work, even though my business was the foundation of the life we lived. She started staying late at her job, then claiming she was exhausted when she got home. Her phone, once left charging in the kitchen, suddenly became glued to her hand. The woman I married was slipping into someone I no longer recognized. My father used to tell me, never fight emotions with emotions. You see a storm coming, you don't scream at the clouds. You board up your house and wait. That's exactly what I did. I didn't argue. I didn't confront her. I started preparing. Quietly. Methodically. The first thing I did was secure what mattered. My father's estate, land, properties, trust accounts, all moved under legal protections that had nothing to do with Allison. The paperwork was airtight, shielded under a foundation that bore my father's name. She couldn't touch it, though she didn't know that. I left just enough surface detail in our joint documents to make her think it was accessible. Next, I started keeping records. Every bank withdrawal she made, every credit card charge, every odd expense that didn't fit our normal pattern. I opened a file and called it contingency. No anger, no commentary, just numbers and dates. I knew one day it would be useful. Then came the hardest part, pretending I didn't notice. I listened to her excuses about late nights at the office. I nodded when she brushed off vacations with friends I'd never met. I didn't challenge her. I simply observed. If she was building a case against me, I was building one against her, brick by brick. I remember one evening vividly. She came home smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. She set her purse down, kissed me on the cheek, and smiled too brightly. I said nothing. Inside, the calculation was simple. She was careless enough to think I was blind, and that meant I already had the advantage. When the divorce papers arrived, delivered to my office with her signature bold at the bottom. I didn't flinch. I signed where required, kept copies, and slipped them into the same folder labeled contingency. By then, my attorney, a man named Harris, already knew what I suspected. He asked me if I wanted to fight fire with fire. I told him no. Fire burns out. Silence lasts longer. That's why, when Allison stood in court demanding 70%, including my father's estate, I didn't have to raise my voice. I just had to let the documents do the talking. She thought she was walking into a battlefield where she held the weapons. She didn't realize she'd been standing inside my minefield the whole time. The trap was set months before that hearing, and she was only just beginning to understand. The first blow didn't come in the courtroom. It came months before, when Allison moved money out of our joint accounts without a word. I noticed the missing funds on a Tuesday morning, logged into the bank before a meeting, and saw transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Thousands at first, then tens of thousands. Most men would have confronted their wives right then, demanding answers, shouting across the kitchen table. I didn't. I quietly downloaded every transaction, filed them in my contingency folder, and closed the laptop. That night, when she kissed me goodnight, I didn't kiss back. But I didn't say anything either. She thought my silence was weakness. It wasn't. It was calculation. Allison became bold after that. She started speaking in ways she never had before. One evening she told a friend over the phone, loud enough for me to hear, "David doesn't even look at our finances. He's too busy playing businessman. He won't see what's coming." I sat in the next room, sipping my drink, and made another note in the file. She thought I was ignorant. She thought she was already winning. The truth was, I had anticipated every move. Years of business deals taught me that betrayal rarely comes from strangers. It comes from people who know your blind spots, the ones who believe you won't fight back. Allison fit the pattern perfectly. By the time the divorce petition landed in my hands, I'd already secured my assets, moved what I needed beyond her reach, and prepared for the storm. She thought the petition was her first strike. To me, it was confirmation that the war had begun. My lawyer, Harris, studied the paperwork and looked at me carefully. "She's going for blood," he said. I nodded. He asked what I wanted to do. I told him the same thing I'd told myself from the beginning. Don't argue. Don't beg. Don't threaten. Just prepare. Weeks later, her attorney filed motions demanding discovery of assets, claiming I was hiding funds, painting me as a manipulator. They wanted bank records, property deeds, corporate filings. Harris handed me the papers and said it would get ugly. I looked at him and said, "Let it," because I knew what they would find. Everything tied up exactly where I wanted it. Everything legitimate, everything legal. They would dig and dig, but all they'd uncover was how wrong Allison had been. Still, she escalated. She told mutual friends I was controlling, that I refused to support her, that I had cut her off. Word got back to me through whispers, sideways glances at social gatherings. I didn't defend myself. I let her build her story, let her weave her net of lies. The tighter she pulled the threads, the easier it would be for me to break them all at once. The pressure was building, and she didn't even realize it. Every withdrawal, every accusation, every false move. She was stacking them like kindling, and I was waiting for the right moment to strike the match. The trick with betrayal is to never let your enemy know when you've started fighting back. Allison believed she was 2 steps ahead, but I had already mapped the board. The documents she thought would prove my supposed deceit were the very same ones that would bury her. One night, long after she had gone to bed, I sat in my office with the lights low and opened a locked drawer. Inside was a slim binder, 2 inches thick, every page time-stamped and notarized. Years of transactions, signed agreements, trust deeds, all under my control. She thought the family estate was part of my personal wealth. She didn't realize it had been moved into a trust long before our marriage. Legally, it was untouchable. That trust was my father's final safeguard, and she had no claim. Still, I let her think she did. I remember leafing through the pages that night, steadying my hand on the paper. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It wasn't about heartbreak or betrayal. It was about precision. Each document was a bullet I never had to fire, because the law itself would do the shooting for me. Harris, my attorney, was the only one I trusted with the full scope. When I handed him copies, his eyes scanned the first few pages, and he leaned back in silence. Then he said quietly that she had no idea what she was walking into. I told him that was the point. She needed to walk straight into the wall before she realized it was there. Allison, meanwhile, kept pushing. She filed for temporary spousal support, claiming I had cut her off from the lifestyle she was accustomed to. She tried to freeze my accounts, but every attempt collapsed under the weight of the paperwork I had already filed months earlier. I never raised my voice, never sent a heated message. Instead, I signed everything she served me, returned copies, and added each document to my growing archive. Proof, layer after layer. The turning point came when I noticed something she had overlooked. Buried in her filings were claims about my father's estate, statements made under oath that she believed it was part of marital property. That was perjury. Not only had she exposed herself legally, she had done it in writing. I didn't confront her. I didn't let on. I simply highlighted the pages, slid them into the binder, and closed the drawer. From that moment, I knew the endgame was set. The court wouldn't just see a greedy spouse. They would see a liar, someone trying to manipulate the system. All I had to do was keep walking the line, never losing composure, never tipping my hand too early. The silence was my weapon, and the documents were my shield. She was pushing herself closer to the edge without realizing I had already built the cliff. Soon, the courtroom would witness the fall. The first sign of pressure came when Allison's attorney started changing his tone. At the beginning, he carried himself like a man walking into an easy victory, full of confidence, convinced his client had me cornered. But as the weeks dragged on, I noticed the cracks. Requests for documents became more frantic. Motions were filed, then quickly withdrawn. Deadlines passed, excuses were offered. Allison didn't notice it, but I did. Her lawyer was beginning to understand what she refused to see. At home, Allison grew restless. She talked louder on the phone, always in another room, always closing the door behind her. I didn't ask questions. I simply listened when I could, noted what I heard, and kept my silence. One night, she stormed into the living room, frustrated, saying her lawyer wasn't aggressive enough, that she might need someone willing to play dirty. I didn't even look up from my glass. My lack of reaction seemed to infuriate her more than any words could have. Meanwhile, Harris advised patience. He told me she was walking into perjury charges if she kept swearing under oath about the estate. He said judges don't like being lied to, and eventually it would all collapse on her. I told him I was willing to wait. I'd built my life on patience. Deals that took years, projects that stretched into decades. A few more months didn't bother me. Then Allison made her next mistake. She tried to refinance one of the properties, assuming I wouldn't notice. But the title was in my name alone, secured by legal structures she couldn't touch. When the bank contacted me to verify the documents, I saw her forged signature alongside mine. I didn't call her out. I didn't confront her. I simply made copies, added them to the binder, and let her dig herself deeper. By now, she was burning through money faster than she could justify. Designer clothes, new jewelry, unexplained trips. She paraded around as if she'd already won, as if the millions were already hers. Friends began asking questions. Some distanced themselves, sensing the storm coming. But Allison doubled down, insisting I was hiding funds, painting herself as the victim of a greedy husband. Every word she spread was another thread tightening around her own throat. The silence started to unsettle her. She expected me to fight, to scream, to break. But I didn't. I ate dinner in silence, signed every paper in silence, moved through the house with the calm of a man who had already won. She mistook it for defeat, but it was discipline. The pressure was no longer mine. It was hers. And with each passing day, I could see it wearing her down. The confident woman who smirked at me across the courtroom was beginning to crack. Her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. Her laughter sounded too forced, too loud. She was unraveling, and all I had to do was keep still. The weight of silence was doing the work for me. The cracks widened when the court ordered a preliminary review of assets. Allison had been so sure the judge would see me as evasive, but instead, he questioned her filings. He pointed out inconsistencies in her sworn statements, subtle contradictions she hadn't expected anyone to catch. Harris and I sat quietly while her lawyer stumbled over explanations. Allison shifted in her chair, her face tightening as the judge reminded her of the penalties for misrepresentation. It was the first time I saw real fear cross her expression. Outside the courtroom that day, Harris told me we didn't need to push yet. Let her speak, he said. The more rope she takes, the less work we'll have to do. I agreed. I had no intention of rushing. Each mistake she made was a nail sealing her own coffin. At home, the atmosphere grew colder. Allison tried to provoke me, accusing me of hiding accounts, threatening to drag my company through the mud, even hinting that she'd tell the press lies about me if she didn't get what she wanted. I gave her nothing. No arguments, no outbursts, no denials. Just silence. She mistook it for weakness, but I could see it gnawing at her. She wanted a fight. I refused to give her one. Her spending spiraled further. One day, I saw the delivery of a luxury car she had financed under her name, assuming the divorce would leave her flush with cash. I watched from the office window as the transporter unloaded it. I didn't say a word. I just photographed the paperwork, noted the loan details, and filed it away. She was living as if she'd already won. That arrogance would be her undoing. Weeks later, the forgery attempt came back to haunt her. The bank flagged the refinance documents as suspicious and submitted them for investigation. They contacted me formally, and I provided the originals, clean, notarized, undeniable. The fraud was obvious. When Harris showed me the bank's letter, I didn't react outwardly. But inside, I knew the trap was beginning to close. Allison didn't yet realize how deep in trouble she was. By now, whispers had reached her. Mutual friends began asking why her attorney seemed nervous in hearings. Some even told me quietly that Allison was losing control, snapping at people, lashing out when questioned. I stayed silent. The less I said, the more her instability spoke for itself. One night, I caught her staring at me across the dinner table, eyes sharp, like she was searching for something in my expression. I gave her nothing. She wanted confirmation that I was scared, that I was cornered. Instead, she found a wall of silence. That silence was more powerful than any words I could have spoken. The pressure wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was hers, and I watched it break her piece by piece. Soon, the moment would come when the judge would see what I already knew, that Allison had walked straight into her own trap. The next hearing was different from the rest. The judge walked in carrying a folder thicker than usual, his expression sharper, less tolerant. Harris had warned me this session would be pivotal. Allison, dressed in designer clothes she likely couldn't afford anymore, leaned back with that same smirk, convinced she was about to corner me once and for all. But the weight of silence had already shifted. This time, she wasn't the predator. She was prey, whether she realized it or not. The judge began by questioning the filings. He asked why Allison had sworn the estate was marital property when the deeds clearly listed it under a trust established years before the marriage. Her attorney stumbled, muttered about misunderstandings, but the judge wasn't amused. He pressed harder, asking if she understood the penalties of lying under oath. The color drained from her face, but she forced a smile, claiming she had relied on her lawyer's advice. The room shifted. Whispers carried across the benches. Harris didn't need to say a word. Neither did I. The silence was already doing the damage. Then the judge produced a letter from the bank. It confirmed what I already knew. Allison had attempted to refinance property without authorization, submitting forged documents. My attorney hadn't even needed to introduce it. The bank had sent it directly to the court as part of their fraud investigation. Allison's smirk faltered. For the first time, she looked toward me, searching for some reaction. I gave her nothing. The judge's patience thinned. He reminded both sides that dishonesty, especially involving forgery, was not a trivial matter. He announced a formal review of Allison's financial behavior, including her spending and the accuracy of her sworn statements. Allison's lawyer shifted in his chair, avoiding her gaze. She sat stiff, hands clenched too tightly in her lap. When the session ended, people in the gallery didn't rush out as they usually did. They lingered, murmuring, stealing glances at Allison as though they'd just witnessed something scandalous. In a way, they had. The cracks in her story were now public. No amount of charm or arrogance could erase what had just been entered into record. That evening, Allison didn't come home. She stayed out, likely with friends who still believed her version of events. I didn't call. I didn't ask questions. I sat in my office, binder open, reviewing the papers one more time. Each page was another weight pressing down on her, another reminder that I didn't need to fight loudly. I just needed to keep standing still. The judge had laughed once before, when I handed him the 2-page document that proved the estate was untouchable. That laughter had cut deeper than any ruling. It had stripped her of the illusion of control. Now, with fraud and perjury hanging over her, I knew the next step wasn't far. The quiet had carried me this far. Soon, it would end the war completely. The final hearing began like a storm on the horizon. Calm skies. But everyone knew what was coming. Allison walked in with her chin high, dressed like she was stepping onto a runway, not into a courtroom. She thought appearances still mattered. She thought confidence could disguise desperation. I knew better. Harris sat beside me, silent, calm. He didn't need to speak much anymore. The evidence spoke for us. The judge opened with a review of the filings. His voice was steady, but the edge was sharp. He summarized the contradictions, the forged documents, the reckless spending. Each sentence cut through the silence, and each time, Allison's posture stiffened. She tried to interrupt, but he raised his hand, silencing her. She wasn't in control anymore, and the room felt it. Then came the moment that ended everything. The judge turned to me, asked if I had any final documents to submit. I stood, reached into my folder, and handed him a slim packet. 2 pages, nothing more. I didn't explain. I didn't argue. I simply said, check again. The judge read the first page. His brow furrowed, then lifted. He flipped to the second. A faint smile tugged at his mouth, and then he laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a smirk. It was genuine laughter, deep enough to echo across the room. The gallery stirred, whispers rippling like waves. Allison froze, staring at him, her face pale. She asked what was so funny, her voice high, trembling. The judge leaned back, still smiling, and said her claim to 70%, including my father's estate, was not only unfounded, but absurd. He explained that the trust documents I'd submitted left no legal avenue for her to touch a single acre, not $1. Her demand had been built on air. Worse, by swearing under oath that she had rights to property clearly protected, she had exposed herself to perjury. Allison's smirk was gone. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the floor. The courtroom, once filled with her bravado, now filled with quiet laughter and disbelief from the gallery. She had overplayed her hand, and everyone knew it. I didn't look at her. I didn't gloat. I stood in silence as the judge issued his decision. My assets remained intact. The estate stayed mine. Her share was reduced to a fraction of what she expected, barely enough to cover her debts. And her attempt to manipulate the court had been preserved in record, a permanent scar on her credibility. When it was over, the judge dismissed the room with a shake of his head, still smiling faintly. Allison didn't move at first. She sat frozen, staring at the papers in front of her like they might change if she willed it hard enough. But they didn't. They never would. That laugh wasn't just the sound of a judge amused by arrogance. It was the sound of her empire collapsing. And it was the sound of my silence finally speaking louder than her lies. The hearing ended, but the echo of the judge's laughter lingered long after we walked out of the courtroom. For Allison, it was more than a legal defeat. It was a public humiliation. The gallery had seen her exposed, her arrogance stripped bare. By the time we stepped into the hallway, whispers had already started, people murmuring about her greed, her lies, her downfall. She tried to hold her composure, walking past me without a glance, but the mask was cracked. I could see the tension in her jaw, the stiffness in her steps. Her attorney trailed behind, carrying files that now felt more like dead weight than ammunition. He didn't say a word to her, and she didn't dare ask. Outside, reporters waited. Divorce hearings of wealthy families always attracted attention, and Allison had made sure to feed the fire, leaking her side of the story weeks earlier. She had painted me as a cold millionaire trying to rob her of what she deserved. Now the narrative had flipped. The questions hurled at her weren't about sympathy. They were about fraud, perjury, forged documents. Cameras flashed, microphones pushed forward. She lifted her chin and kept walking, but everyone could see it. She was finished. I didn't stop. I didn't speak to the press. I walked straight past them, my silence louder than any statement. Harris followed, his expression calm, professional. Once we reached the street, he said quietly that this was as clean a victory as he'd ever seen. I didn't respond. Victories don't need celebration when they're inevitable. In the days that followed, the fallout spread. Allison's spending habits caught up with her. The luxury car was repossessed, her credit cards frozen, her friends distant. Those who once believed her lies now avoided her. unwilling to be tied to someone whose reputation had collapsed in public. She tried to rally sympathy, telling anyone who would listen that she'd been tricked, that I'd manipulated the system. But there was no system to manipulate. There was only the truth, written in black and white. One afternoon, I passed her in town by chance. She stood outside a cafe, sunglasses on, talking animatedly on her phone. When she noticed me, her words faltered, her body stiffened. She expected me to look at her, to acknowledge her, to give her some reaction she could cling to. I didn't. I walked by without a word, as if she were a stranger. That, more than anything, seemed to cut the deepest. The war she thought she was waging had ended without a single loud battle. No shouting matches, no desperate pleas, no public spectacle from my side. Just silence, steady and unshaken, until the weight of her own lies crushed her. For me, it was never about revenge. It was about survival. And survival doesn't announce itself. It simply walks away, leaving the wreckage behind. In the weeks after the final hearing, the silence in my house felt different. Before, it had been the quiet of preparation, of strategy, of waiting for the right moment. Now it was the quiet of resolution. The war was over, and I had walked away without raising my voice. Allison's presence lingered only in paperwork and memories, both filed away in drawers I no longer opened. Harris called me once more to confirm everything was finalized. The settlement was clean, the estate untouched, the assets secure. Allison's share barely covered her debts, leaving her with nothing of what she had envisioned. He asked me if I wanted to pursue charges for fraud and perjury. I told him no. The court of law had done its job, but the court of reputation had punished her more severely than I ever could. He said he understood, and that was the end of our conversation. I kept working, kept moving forward. My company thrived, projects expanded, life moved on. But every now and then, I'd hear whispers about Allison, how she had downsized, how her friends had abandoned her, how she was still trying to spin the story in her favor. People listened politely, but no one believed her anymore. Her name had become shorthand for greed and downfall, and she had carved it herself. One evening, I drove out to my father's estate. The land stretched wide, just as it always had, untouched by the storm that had raged in court. I walked the property, the same trails I had walked as a boy, and thought about how close she had come to taking it all. Not because she had any right to it, but because she believed arrogance could replace truth. Standing there, I realized that was her true failure. Not the lies, not the fraud, but the belief that noise was stronger than silence. When people asked me how I'd won, I never gave details. I didn't tell them about the binder, the documents, or the months of preparation. I simply said I stayed quiet, because sometimes silence is the sharpest blade. They'd nod, not fully understanding, but I didn't need them to. The victory wasn't theirs to comprehend. It was mine to carry, privately, like the weight of a stone that steadied me rather than dragged me down. In the end, Allison was left with nothing but her own echo, her words, her smirk, her arrogance, all turned back against her. I didn't destroy her. She destroyed herself. All I did was stand still long enough to let it happen. Some men fight with anger. Some fight with fire. Me? I fought with silence. And in that silence, I won everything that mattered. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.